Hi everyone. I hope you're all okay and settled in the nano degree now. It's been a month and a couple of days, so I hope you're settled in. You're used to how things go around here. You're learning new stuff. You're exciting new stuff, beneficial to you. I hope you're finding the projects interesting. I will not say easy because they're not quite easy, as I'm sure you have experienced in the second project. Today, I would like to welcome you to the fifth content webinar. This week, we'll be talking about browser events. Off the top, I will tell you that browser events are what we use to respond to user interactions on our web page. Any interesting web page has user interaction enabled, so users can interact, click on things, and our website or web app will respond in some kind of way, which makes it interesting. Also, your second project requires extensive usage of browser events as click events and others. So I think that it's going to be beneficial for you to know exactly what browser events are, how we construct them, and how to work with them as well. Before we get into that, I would like to give praise to all of you who have started to develop the second project. I'm very proud because I know what you're going through. I know it's a big struggle to try and do this project, but hang in there. We're all behind you, and I am here all the time to explain anything or help in any way I can. It's gonna be a big struggle for you to get this project done, but in the end, it will be worth it. I promise. You'll learn a lot of valuable things. Your JavaScript will be really enhanced, and you feel a lot more comfortable with it after you complete this project. And in the future, you'll be quite glad you've done it. Okay, let's begin with the presentation I have made as always. I will be sending this to you along with links to resources on the web where you can learn more about browser events. And we're going to have a few coding demos on CodePen, just to have a look at what browser events are, how we construct them, and I will send you all that after the presentation. So let's get to the presentation. Just let me share the screen. There we go. Okay, so here's our topic, browser events. This is our agenda. First off, we'll look at some definitions to try to make sense of what browser events are and have some kind of reference definition we can use in the future. After that, we'll take a look at how browser events are triggered. The users, that is us, are responsible for triggering them in almost all of the situations in which events are triggered. Of course, the DOM construction process also dispatches some events. It's not just the users, so we'll keep that in mind for later. As we discussed in previous weeks, pretty much everything in object is an object in JavaScript, and the event in the browser is no different. It's just an object, and it has properties and methods just like any other object. Um, in this, in the next slide, we'll take a look at what those are and what we can use them for. After that, we'll see the phases of an event. Events have life cycles, and those life cycles consists of phases. Um, the event is like a child, and it matures in different phases in which it can do different things. After we've looked at what events are and what properties and methods they have, we'll see how we can handle them. In other words, respond to them. It's very easy to handle an event. We just need a function, a simple function. These type of functions have fancy names, and that's event handlers. And we'll see what they look like and how we can use them to respond to user interactions. So remember, event handlers is just a fancy name for a function that is attached to event handlers. Lastly, we'll take a look at the last of the phases, and that is the most important in the life cycle of an event, which is event bubbling. This is a special phase which we can use to take advantage of an advanced technique called event delegation. This is a bit of an advanced topic, which by no means is required. So if you don't feel like knowing all this right now at this initial phase of learning JavaScript, you can kind of disregard this topic, but I wanted to mention it just so you hear that these two concepts actually exist. After I finish the presentation, we'll have a look at coding examples, and after them, I will show you a mock-up project of the memory game project that tackles a difficulty I'm sure you're having while developing it, and I'll show you a sample solution to overcome this difficulty. The memory game project consists of a lot of complex parts which are really hard to get your head around, and I want to show you this one because I found it the most confusing and difficult to overcome when I was building the project. Okay, let's start with the first topic in the first slide. Here we'll start with the definitions. I've selected 3 of them, which I think will incorporate all the essential parts of a useful definition of an event in the browser. The first one, of course, comes from the Mozilla Developer Network. As I've said before, this is probably the most important site for developers because its content is created by developers for developers. However, like everything that's sort of official and famous, it's a bit difficult to understand sometimes. So let's just go through this definition and see if we can sort of find some sense in what's written here. DOM events are sent to notify code of interesting things that have taken place. So events are some kind of notifications of interesting things. Each event is represented by an object. This is very important. Each event is represented by an object which is based on the event interface and may have additional custom fields and or functions used to get additional information about what happened. Events can represent everything from basic user interactions to automated notifications of things happening in the rendering model. So I know this definition is a bit overwhelming for you probably. Most definitions on MDN are like that, sadly. But let's try to destructure it into components, which we'll try to explain, and we'll see that it's not that difficult to understand actually. The first sentence is plain and simple. Events notify code, which we've written in our scripts. So here, code comes to signify the code we've written in our JavaScript file. The code in our scripts that a certain event has taken place, and once our code is notified, we can do something if we want. So those are the event handlers that I mentioned a few minutes ago. After that, the definition proceeds to say that the event is just an object based on the event interface. Here, you might be wondering what an interface is and what the event interface is actually. So the concept of an interface in web development is pretty, I don't want to say hard to get, but it's not obvious at first. So, but I'll try to explain it only to make this definition a bit clearer. So do check out what an interface is and all the other interfaces. There are many of them on MDN. I've included a link later. But as of now, we'll try to adopt some kind of definition of an interface so you can understand what it is. An interface is like a constructor. So a constructor that specifies what type of properties and methods the object that belongs to this interface has. So remember that we said the interface is like a constructor, so we construct an object from this constructor. So all the all the methods and properties, that the event interface has are embedded into this object that is generated from the interface. So the interface is something like a map of sorts, that we can navigate through the object that is generated by this interface. Believe it or not, every HTML element also has an interface, since all of them are objects. Every HTML element, so the anchor tag, the HTML tag, the div tag, the P tag, all of them have their own interfaces, which describe what kind of properties and methods they have as standalone objects. So the interface is a very important thing, and we should always look to it to understand what type of object we're dealing with and what properties and methods we can use on it. So the interface is like a map to navigate our way in the interaction with objects. That's I think a good definition for now, at least. So all browser events are part of this event interface. Additionally, each event is part of well, I don't want to say sub-interface, but each event object is part of the event interface, which has a child interface. So let's call it a sub-interface, which is specific for it. And the sub-interface, so the child interface, specifies what methods and properties come with this specific event object, additional to the ones that the event interface gave it. So we have separate interfaces for keyboard events, for mouse events, for scroll events, everything has its own interface. That's That's what the part about the additional fields says. So here we have additional custom fields and our functions to get additional information. That's what um, MDN have described as the other interfaces besides the event interface. And lastly, we see that events can represent user interactions and notifications in the DOM. The rendering model here signifies the DOM. This definition is a bit hard to remember and understand, so let's have a look at another one. This one is a lot shorter. An event is a signal that something has happened. That's pretty self-explanatory, and we get no mention of interfaces, rendering models, and all that complex stuff. We just have that the event presents a signal that something has happened. The signal can be everything from notifications that the DOM construction process has finished, so all the DOM nodes are created and put in the right order on the HTML, and we get an event dispatched from the browser. And as you may have already seen, this event is used by jQuery to signify when the functions we have written in our JavaScript file have to run. So in order to modify HTML, we first have to have HTML on the page. So we should wait for this specific event that the DOM construction process has finished to be dispatched in order to be able to do anything on the page. So other events are maybe signal that the last child of the container div has been clicked on, you know, I don't know, a scrolling of the page, zooming, anything. Anything can be an event. The array of events that we get notifications for is truly massive. Okay, after taking a look at these two definitions, I came up with my own one, which I want to share with you. It's by no means something you have to remember, but I think it's a good way to think about events. So, events are notifications that are sent to notify the code that something happened on the page. They take the form of objects whose properties and methods we can use to respond to their user interaction or signals the DOM is sending. We've talked about pretty much all the concepts listed here. I think that for now we can gloss over the interfaces and all that complex stuff and remember that events are simply objects that have properties and methods that are useful to us to, I don't know, pre-code, I guess, responses to these events that take the form of functions. Okay, right. Now that we have a notion of what events are, let's see how they're triggered. Pretty much everything we do triggers some kind of event in the browser. Just moving the mouse triggers millions of events per second. We trigger an event every time we move our mouse a pixel in any direction. Other examples are scrolling, clicking, pressing a key on our keyboard, double-clicking, opening the context menu with a right click, submitting a form, and many others. Literally hundreds of events are flying around at any time on a web page, even if we're not doing anything special. So even if we're not typing, we're not, I don't know, playing some kind of video, events, or hundreds of events actually, are flying around without our knowledge as users. What we should know as well is that the DOM also triggers events when certain things happen. As we mentioned before, probably the most important of them is the event that the DOM dispatches when the DOM construction process is finished. Um, that's important because only then we should start executing our JavaScript code, because only then we can select the content on the page. So if you try to select an HTML document before the DOM construction process is finished, we will simply not get the desired functionality that we're after. Right, so pretty much everything we do triggers an event, and that's useful to know. Now let's see what the event object looks like and is it of any use to us. As we mentioned in the first definition, the one by the Mozilla Developer Network, the browser event is part of the event API. API here stands for Application Programming Interface, or as we saw previously, interface for short. API is a common thing you'll be seeing all the time when you get to more advanced topics. So even you're gonna have to implement or interact with an API in your last project, which is a bit difficult to do, but after having a bit of knowledge here about what an API is, you'll get a head start then, so it's good to know. There are interfaces or APIs, like we said, those are two interchangeable, for every single browser event: keyboard events, mouse events, drag events, and others. All of these events share the properties and objects of the event interface and their respective interfaces. The keyboard event, the mouse event, and others give their unique properties and methods that are different from all the others. Here I have made a screen capture of a mouse event. As you can see here, I don't know if you can see it, but here the mouse event. This is just a console log of it, but as you can see, it's an object. Some of the properties that are listed here, you can see all of them. Control key, this signifies if we've pressed the control key when we're clicking, so it's set to false. We have the client Y, client X, cancelable, buttons, button, screen X, screen Y. That's the location where the click has occurred. So I had clicked on this, I had triggered this event when I was on a big screen, so that's why we get the big resolution here. Oops, sorry. Here we have the shift key, which signifies if we had pressed shift while clicking. We have the SRC element and many others, as you can see. The most important property, and the one that we will make the most use of in an event, is right here, the target property. We'll talk about it specifically a bit later, but for now I want to direct your attention here so you can see this is the target element. Here we also have the type, which is a click. That's useful to know as well. The most important method of the event object, without a doubt, is the prevent default method. It allows us to prevent default functionality. We can't see it here, but here you can see default prevented, this property here, not a method. But the prevent default method, if we use it on the event object that gets dispatched once we click an anchor tag, we can prevent its default behavior and specify what should happen ourselves. So for instance, when we click on an anchor tag, it automatically redirects us to another web page. And using this method, the prevent default method, we can specify what should happen ourselves. And so it's very useful in a lot of cases, and you'll be seeing it multiple times. And that's pretty much the event object. Remember, this is just a mouse event. There are many other events, event types, APIs. There you can see them: pointer event, fetch event, drag event, all of them. And that's just 6 of them. There are many more. This is just a mouse event. I have provided you with a link to all the event APIs in the resources, where you can check out all the properties and methods for all event APIs. Now, let's discuss the target property that every object has. Every event object has, actually. This property, what's unique about it is that it stores a reference to the element where the event had occurred. This is very handy because we don't have to use any DOM selection methods like get elements by class name or query selector or get element by ID or any other one. Imagine, for instance, that there is a list of similar items that don't have any difference between them. So imagine an unordered list with many li items. The target property will return exactly the element on which the event has occurred. It is just like a variable which we can modify or interact with. So by clicking on one of the li elements in our unordered list, the event object that's triggered knows exactly which li element was clicked and gives us a reference to it, so we can modify or interact with it in any way we want. And that's essentially what the target property is and how we can use it. We'll see a bit later an example usage. Now, let's have a look at the different phases of the life cycle of an event. There are 3 phases: the capturing phase, the targeting phase, and the bubbling phase. The capturing phase comprises all the DOM elements on the trip. On the trip, actually. Trip here is said metaphorically, from the document to the parent of the target element on which an event was triggered. So in other words, when everything from the document, this includes everything from the document to the target, but not including the target itself. So here the event object is getting constructed, but we don't yet have the target property on it set. So we don't yet have a reference to where the event occurred. The targeting phase occurs when an event reaches the target. So then the event fired on the target, the event object now has a reference to the target element on which it occurred, and that happens during the targeting phase. And finally, the bubbling phase comprises all the DOM elements encountered on the return trip from the target back to the document. So bubbling gives us the freedom of handling an event on any element by its parents. So like I said, we'll discuss bubbling a bit later in a bit more depth because it's interesting to know, and it allows us to implement a technique called event delegation, which is very beneficial. And that's the 3 phases of an event. I don't think we should focus so much on this right now, and just try to get a bit of practice with events. So let's just move on to the next slide. Now let's see the way to react to events in our code. The way we handle events or react to them is through functions called event handlers. We define functions that we assign to event listeners on an HTML element. In the functions, we specify what should happen when this type of event occurs. For example, when we click on a div, we want to change its background color. We do this with event handlers. Event handlers have a very important parameter, which you can see here in the mini event handler I have constructed. This here, the event parameter is the event object itself, which we just saw a few slides ago, the one with the client X, the target, the src element properties. So in order to have access to these properties and methods of the event object, we have to specify here in the event handler, this function, that we want to receive this event object. If we don't specify this parameter, we will still have the function which we have specified as an event handler called, but we won't have access to the event object inside it. So we still can run a function here, but it won't have a reference to the event objects, and we will lose the chance to interact in any way with it. Here, this function, this event handler, just sends an alert to the user that he has triggered an event. So it's not too useful in any way, but it's just a small example of what an event handler is. You should just remember that it's just a function that performs an action which takes the form of another function based on a certain events. And it's only executed when the event we've specified occurs. So a click event handler will not run when we double click an event in an HTML element, sorry. So unless we explicitly click the element on which we define the event handler, the function we've specified will not run. Okay, so now that we know what event handlers are, let's see how we create them. There are two ways we can assign a handler function to an event, for an event. So to put it directly on the HTML element in an attribute called here, since we're setting up an event handler of a click event, the attribute is called onClick, as you can see here in the green text. Generally, we decide what event we want to listen for and place a simple on before it. Here, since we want to listen for a click event, we just precede the click by on, as you can see here, on click. So if, for example, we wanted to listen for a hover event, we'd say on hover, on click, on hover, on mouse down, on mouse leave. That's everything is preceded with on. So we have to decide what the event we want to listen for is, and we place an on before it, before the name of the event. In this case, we just send an alert like we saw before, saying click. This method, however, is not very convenient, and most of the time we want to have a complex function as a response to an event instead of just alerting the text click like we do here. And that means that if we write a really long code here, a really long function, our HTML will become unreadable and it will become very difficult for other developers who look at our code to understand what is happening. So that's why the second method, which we see here, a combination of HTML and JavaScript, is the one we should use in practice. Here, firstly, we select the HTML element here stored in this button variable. And in JavaScript, we place an event handler on it using again here the attribute we saw on click. Here we have two ways of implementing this approach. To define the function in the event handler like we do here using the equal sign, and we define an anonymous function, or we could previously define the function here like this one, say thanks, and after we've defined it we place the event handler and we set it equal to a created function by us previously. And in very general terms, these are a few ways to interact and react actually to events in JavaScript. We also have an add event listener method to every HTML object, and we'll see how we can use that a bit later. Now let's see the advanced topics I wanted to mention. Don't sweat it if you don't understand what I'm trying to say here. We'll just mention these things just to get a notion that they exist. And when you feel a bit more comfortable with events, you can flip back and try to understand them. So here are the definitions. Event bubbling, as you may remember, is the final phase of an event's life cycle. Event bubbling is when an event is triggered on an element. The same event is triggered on all parent elements all the way up to the HTML element. This essentially means that if we have an ordered list and we click a list item on it, this specific event is going to be triggered, like the click event is going to be triggered on the list item itself, on the unordered list element, and any parents that the unordered list element may have, and all the way up to the body tag that will an event will be triggered there as well, and all the way up to the parent of the body tag, which is the HTML tag. So the element on which the event actually occurred is the target element, and that's the property we get on the event object. So that's event bubbling. And knowing event bubbling, we can make use of event delegation. So if the event bubbles up in the DOM tree, as it does, we just saw that data happens in event bubbling. And if we know where the event was fired, we actually do because of the target element. Then we can attach an event handler, and if we an event handler to a parent element, and we wait for the event to bubble up and do whatever we want. So when we have a parent with a lot of similar child elements, we place the event listener on the parent and then determine on which child it was fired. So for example, we take the unordered element, unordered list, actually, sorry, and place our event handler on the unordered list element itself to determine on which of its li child elements, the event has occurred. And that's generally what event delegation is. Like I said, it's a bit uh, complex, but when you feel comfortable with browser events, do check these out. So I've prepared a few resources for further studying browser events. Let's have a quick look at them. The first one is a set of exercises to practice your understanding of browser events. Some of them are quite difficult, but the first ones, um, I think you can have a go at them. And if you're feeling confident, try the more advanced ones. Um, they're, these are good exercises to test your knowledge about browser events. The second one is the MDN event reference, which includes all the properties and objects that all the properties and methods that every object has. The third one is an extract from the famous book Enochian JavaScript. You may have heard about that one. And that deals with browser events. I highly suggest you look at that because it contains easy to understand definitions and good examples about browser events. And finally, the keyboard browser events reference. You can check that out as well. And that's it for the presentation. Now let's move over to some coding examples. And we have to make use of CodePen for that. Here is the part for the mouse browser events. I thought that we should only take a look at some mouse events because if we try to look at all browser events, it would take a long time. So I just wanted to show you best practices when we want to interact with events. Here, as you can see, probably I have a list of buttons, and here we have an input field, and here a button that we'll see what it does later. Here I have defined in the JavaScript. Let's look at the JavaScript. Here I have simply selected all the green buttons as you can see here, and a few functions. This function, reset page, is what is attached to an on-click on this reset all button, and we'll see what it resets in a bit. The display code here, you'll also see what it does in a bit. And here are the event listeners. So here I am using the method I mentioned a bit earlier, add event listener. This here takes in two parameters. It takes the type of event, so here the click, here I'm using double click, the context menu, which is simply a right click, the mouse over, mouse leave, the wheel, the select, and the click again for this button. Here are all the events I have shown you here, and here you can see the prevent default methods of the objects. Here the E variable, we're using the event object, and the display codes here, the function that we defined earlier. So the first parameter that the add event listener method accepts is the type of the event we want to listen for. Then we place a simple comma, as you can see here, and here is a callback function, which simply calls the display code function. We place these methods add event listener to all the variables we have set previously here, which simply select all the green buttons here you can see. So let us trigger some events. As you can see, I have put the instructions in the buttons to notify what you must do in order to trigger the event that is placed on this element. So this element here, as you can see, is triggered by a click. So once we click this element, something should happen. So let's click it. And there it is. A little element pops up which holds the way we've selected the element. So here with document query selector with an ID of click, we have selected it and we've added the event listener with type of click and the callback function. And that's what's gonna happen in all these events here. So this one was triggered by a click. This one should be triggered by a double click. So if I, for example, click only one time, nothing happens because the event we have specified for it is not the one that's happening. So if we right click it, nothing happens as well. If we hover over it, nothing happens. If we click the middle mouse button, nothing happens. So let's double click and trigger the event we have placed an event listener for. And there we go, the double click mouse event. Notice how it's DBL click. It's not double click the whole word. Here we have to right click to trigger the event that's placed on this element. Again, if we click it with the left mouse button, nothing's gonna happen, as you can see. So if we right click, there we go, the context menu. Here's the event listener, add event listener, context menu, and the function, which here we accept the event object, which we abbreviate with E. So as you may know, clicking the right mouse button anywhere on the page should open a menu, and here it is. But here, because we have used the event prevent default method, nothing happens. So this event prevents the default functionality we would have when we click outside this element. Here it is, and here nothing happens. So if we mouse over here, we should trigger an event. We're not clicking anything, we're just mousing over. And we've triggered this event as well. So this event is called mouse over or hover, as you may know from CSS. Here, if we simply mouse over, nothing happens. But once we leave this element after we've moused over, an event is triggered as well, the mouse leave event, as you can see. And here we have to scroll with our mouse to trigger the event. And there it is. We scrolled and we've triggered the event called wheel. And finally, this is an input field, so we can type anything. And we have to select this text to trigger an event. And there it is. This is the select event. And here we've set a click event handler, which should reset the page. And there it is. All the elements are back to normal. So that was, in a nutshell, how we react to browser events. Again, we've just included some mouse events. There are other mouse events as well, and there are keyboard events, zoom events, all of that. But sadly, this video is not long enough for me to demonstrate all of them. if you want to get a notion of all the events, you can just type in MDN or go there by the link I have provided you with. And now I wanted to um, explain a bit of a difficult part of the second project, which you may be struggling with. I for certain struggled with it, so I thought it would be a good thing to help you and point you out a solution to a part of this. So once I started the second project, I wanted to know how the cards were flipped in the video that Udacity provided us with. Essentially, I wanted to know how to do this. So when I get here and have these cards, I wanted to click on it and show the other side of the card with some content in it. So essentially, I wanted to do this. As you can see, the card flipped, the other side went back, and we see what content is there. There we go again and again. And then I wanted to be able to close the card. I didn't know how to do this, and I struggled with it a long time. So I wanted to show you a solution to it. First off, let's start with the HTML. As you can see, there are 6 cards, and what we should see here is that there are 6 cards which consist of 2 divs, which both share the card side class, and the only difference is the name of the second class, front and back. So as you can see, this is a single card. A div with a class of card that stores 2 other divs. This one and this one. Both of them have the class of card side, this one and this one, and the only difference between them is that one has the card side front and the other has the card side back, where the content is 1, 2, and 3. So the CSS we apply makes both of these divs in the card div be on top of one another, and the JavaScript code that we've written flips them so we can see the other div when we select one of them. So the CSS here, actually this is the body, which is the container. The canvas is the orange part right here, which stores all the cards. This is nothing really too interesting. And here is the card selector. It has a width of 30% of the parent, so that's why we have 90% of the width of the canvas occupied by these 3 cards, and the height is 40%. So the 80% of the width of the height of the canvas is occupied by these 2 cards, these 2 and these 2. It has a border radius, a box shadow, and a property here, perspective, which makes this animation look a bit better. So it does nothing else. And for now, you can ignore it. Every card has 2 divs in it, as we saw, and both of them have this card side class. Here, the backface visibility hidden property prevents the back of the element to be seen. So if we disable this, look what happens. We can see the back side of the cards, which is not what we want, and the backface visibility hidden helps us with that. The transition rule here just simply slows down the animation and makes it look nicer. Here is the class that the front side, so this yellow, Um, as here we specify that it should be yellow. It's nothing special, it's nothing else. Just a simple yellow color. And the backside, the card side back class is what's interesting here. It has absolute positioning um, is in order to place this second div immediately behind the first one. This element starts rotated initially. Here we can see it's rotated 180 degrees. That's something we can see if we remove this back face visibility. Here you can see the 3, the 2, the 1, and all of them are rotated. So that's why they have this right placed text. That's because of the rotation. This is why we can't see it. It has its back turned to us in a way. So once we click the card, we reverse this rotation with the card side active class. And here it is, the card side active class. So it sets the transform rotates Y to 0 degrees, something we had here to 180, so it turns back to 0. And the other side of the card, which was initially active, is now rotated minus 180 degrees. So this here right now, the yellow part of the card has 0 degrees rotation, and once we click it, we apply this card side passive class to it, and that's what gives us the rotation, and that's why both switch places like they do here. Once we click it, both classes are reversed, and that's why we get our yellow card back. And that's the CSS and the HTML. The JavaScript is actually the more interesting part. And as you can see, it's just a function here, a function expression, just a variable holding the selection of all the card side back elements, the ones that are with the white background color, the text in them, and the front of the cards, the yellow part, as you can see here, the divs with the yellow color. Here we select them both and store them in variables. Here we loop over them using the for each loop. Remember, the query selector all returns a node list, which has a method called for each, which allows us to loop over every element here signified by the card variable. So we use the card variable here so we can store the element we're currently looping over, and add an event listener to it of click. And as you may remember, the add event listener method has the first parameter is the type of event, so here click, and the next one is the flip, this variable here, which stores the function which we want to run when an element is clicked. We apply the same here for the back cards. And now let's see what the flip function does. Notice that it's an arrow function signified by this, so it's ES6. This E, as you may remember, is an abbreviation of the event object. So here, every time the click event runs, we want to have access to it. And that's how we get access to the event object. First off, in the function, we check over the event.target. So here e.target signifies the element we have clicked, and here it's the third card, and that's and JavaScript knows it is. because we've specified that E target right here. So now that we have a reference to the target element, we access its class list property, which stores all the classes it has, and using this method contains, we specify that we want to look if the list of classes has card side front on it. So if the target element that we've clicked has the card side front class in it, so essentially if it's any one of these yellow elements, if that's true, then this element should have, we should toggle the card side passive, which rotates it back 180 degrees to its class list. So here class list.toggle is what does this. And here we use again the event.target to access the next element sibling property, which gives us exactly the card, so the div with a card side back. And again we use the class list property and the toggle method on it to place the card side active on it. So the card side active, as you may remember, rotates it back, so it removes the rotation which it initially has. So here we are accessing this rule by clicking this yellow here. There we go. The backside received the card side active class and it rotated back, and the front of it received the card side passive, and that's why it rotated away. And here, if this rule that we've specified, if the element we've clicked does not contain the card side front class in its class list, simply the opposite happens. We trigger the active class on the back, on the front here on the yellow side of the element. Then we trigger the passive card side passive of the yellow, of the white div of the card, sorry. The reason for this if-else statement is that I wanted to construct a function that we can use on both of the event handlers. So the reason for this check here is that we use only one single function here. If we want it, we can construct two different functions for both of the event handlers. So we can place this functionality into a separate function and this functionality into a separate function and assign them to the appropriate places. But I've gone for a more concise method of doing things. And so that's what I wanted to show you. I hope this is useful. It took me a lot of time to figure it out, and I hope I have shortened the time that you need to get this done. I will share this with you so you have it on your computer and you can use it. And that's pretty much it for the webinar today. I hope it was beneficial to you in some way, and I'll be sending all the materials shortly. And remember that if you have any questions, you can ask me anytime. And I wish you the best of luck on your project. I know you're gonna need that. Just stay calm and stay motivated, and I wish you the best of luck. And that's it for me. Thank you for watching.